sort of cool. I feel like I have my own little talk show up here. I sort of move sets, and then we show a little video about you. It's so great. How you doing?
I'm well, thank you.
Good. It's nice to see you here.
Good to be here.
We talked a couple years ago in Berlin, shortly after you had bought this little football club called Chelsea. And it's been an interesting intervening couple of years. I want to talk about your entire sports portfolio, but I think there might be a run on the stage if I didn't start by asking you about Chelsea. And in the context of what you've been working on in sports over the last 10, 20 years, what's been the biggest lesson? What's been the biggest thing you've taken away from the last 2 years when it comes to Chelsea?
Well, I think the number one thing is you got to be patient. You know, I think you're putting something together and you're expecting it to come together really quickly, and the reality is that anything really good takes a little bit of time. And so I think patience was always a thought. I mean, when we bought the Dodgers, you know, and we started the season in 2013, the team basically started 15 and 25.
Yeah.
And, you know, we were struggling, you know, but we kind of just kept sticking to the plan, and, you know, we knew that the plan, or we believed the plan was the right plan at the time. And, you know, we went through a similar thing with Chelsea. You know, and you got to have the resolve to kind of not hear all the noise going on around you, and at the same time, you know, remain patient and committed to the plan.
And you feel good about your plan? I mean, listen, on the pitch, it's been a great little run. I mean,
since Boxing Day, we're the fourth best team in the Premier League.
Right.
You know, so when you look at, you know, what's going on, you know, it feels better and better.
And so how does that influence, I mean, winning obviously floats all boats in a lot of ways. What's the next business decision you feel like you need to make with your partners at CFC?
Well, long term, what we're working on is what's the stadium plan going to be. You know, I think we've got, you know, the really unique spot in London. You know, so many people can walk to come to a Chelsea game, and, you know, we're basically in the heart of West London. But, you know, we only have a stadium that seats about 40,000. Mm-hmm. And to be able to upgrade the quality of the stadium and the size of the stadium, you know, is really a priority for us over the course of the next decade.
Right. And you think that'll start pretty soon?
I mean, it's already starting.
Yeah.
Right? But, you know, you have to have, you know, a lot of conversations with a lot of constituencies, because, you know, you're in the middle of London. Right. And, you know, I think the good news is you're in the middle of London, but the bad news is you're in the middle of London.
Right. And so as we zoom out a little bit, I mean, it's sort of fascinating. We saw a little bit of it in the video. You think about the Dodgers, the Lakers, Chelsea. I mean, these are three, you know, clearly, you know, as an American, certainly the Dodgers and the Lakers, you know, hit bigger in terms of their cultural import. What are the lessons you take from those two franchises? Maybe let's talk about the Dodgers for a second, because, you know, as you say, first blush, tough little run. Now you have arguably the most exciting player maybe to play the game in this century in Shohei Otani. How do you maximize him as an asset, I guess, since we are talking business?
Well, I think just to put it in context, like last year, the Rangers played the Diamondbacks in the World Series. And in the aggregate, there was 45 million people that watched that series. When we announced the Otani signing at his press conference, there was 70 million people that watched. Wow. When we were in Korea starting the season, the amount of fandom, you know, anytime you go in Tokyo, you know, you see Otani. The amount of people who are following, I mean, just last night when he hit a home run, he's now batting .361, so he's the #1 batter in the league. And he's hit, you know, the second most home runs. And last night when he hit a home run against the San Francisco Giants, the amount of cheering for him, you know, was almost something that you never hear when the Dodgers are in San Francisco.
Right.
And that's because people travel to see him. I mean, he is every city, you know, you have this new fan base that's really focused on all things Otani.
Right. And so what does that mean for the franchise, and what are the business decisions that you make, and how does that influence other decisions you make having this person? I mean, especially the structure of the deal allows for more spending in the interim, right? In terms of the way you structured his massive contract, right?
Well, I mean, obviously he was excited about that,
Yeah.
right? Because what he really wanted from us was a commitment to win on the field. And, you know, for people who don't know, basically it's the largest sports contract, you know, in the world. The notional amount was $700 million. And, you know, it's a 10-year playing contract with a 20-year payout. So for the first 10 years, he makes $2 million a year. And for years 11 through 20, he made $68 million a year. Right? So basically, when you think about what the average annual value of that is, it's roughly $44 million a year. And he did that because he wanted us to be able to invest in the team and win now. So that allowed us to go get, you know, a couple other pitchers because we had the financial flexibility to do it. You know, but obviously you've got, you know, a pitcher and a hitter in Otani. So you got a top 5 hitter in the world, you've got a top 5 pitcher in the world, and you get an extra roster spot out of it.
Right.
Right. So, you know, most people are playing with 25 people. You know, we're playing with 26.
Right. And so as you think about, you know, the lessons of the Dodgers, how do you apply that? I mean, whether it's the long-term investment thesis, like how does that play out across the rest of the portfolio?
Well, the first thing I think, you know, from our point of view, you know, we believe the brands really matter. And, you know, if you look at the Dodgers, you know, in the U.S., it's a giant brand. You know, they were the first team to have an African-American player in Jackie Robinson. And then, of course, I would argue that the Lakers in the 80s with the Celtics really built the NBA. Mm-hmm. You know, both the Lakers and the Celtics each have 17 titles. So, you know, those are the two dominant teams. And back in the 80s when the NBA was really kind of getting going, you know, because before that, there was questions whether the NBA would survive.
Yeah.
And you had Magic Johnson versus Larry Bird, still the most watched NCAA finals game in the history of, you know, NCAA basketball, college basketball. And those two guys came into the league at the right time, you know, and really built both brands.
Right.
And so I think from our perspective, it's really hard to recreate a brand. It's really hard to extend a brand, you know, from one level into another level. So, you know, the brands that are the Lakers and Dodgers and Chelsea, they're global brands.
Right.
You know, and that's just really hard to replicate.
And so what do you need to do to further the Chelsea global brand? Because, you know, obviously it is a global brand, but probably trails some of its rivals in the EPL. Where do you need to invest there to ensure that it continues to grow?
Well, I think, as you said earlier, you know, winning is clearly the most important thing. You know, so we're focused on winning. The second thing is having what we think is a really young and exciting team.
Right.
You know, that's going to be around together for a long time. Because if you look at franchises that, you know, dominate for periods of time, it's because they have real stability in the team, you know, real stability in the front office, real stability in, you know, the coaching. So, you know, to be able to lay the groundwork, to be able to start with the stability on the team, you know, by having a young team that has, you know, longer than average contracts. You know, and the reality is in European football, you know, if you're a 7-year contract, the way we look at that is really it's a 5-year contract, right? Because, you know, the capitalization of the transfer value is such that you're never going to let a contract expire down to the last year.
Right.
You're either going to extend the contract or you're going to figure out, you know, what's next, you know, for that player. So, you know, when we were looking at that, we're thinking a lot about how do we have stability, how do we have a core, and, you know, the Dodgers are the same thing. Right now, if you look at our top 3 players in the lineup, right, you've got Mookie Betts, who, you know, we signed to a 10-year contract. We've got Shohei Otani batting second, who is also on a 10-year contract. And we got Freddie Freeman, who's on an 8-year contract. So, the duration that we have for those guys to develop together, is really what we think makes, the potential. Obviously, it doesn't guarantee anything.
Right.
But it's laying the framework for the foundation for something that has the ability to come together as it, figures itself out.
Right. And is that a story that you feel like that is starting to get through on the Chelsea side? Because, let's be honest, taking a lot of heat, and I know you probably isolate yourself from a lot of the noise, but like for the spending. But you look at that as an investment.
That's the other thing I don't think, right?
Right.
When people talk about spending, the way I think about it is we're investing. Mm-hmm. And when we have, a collection of players, and really those players continue to hold their value.
Right.
Right. So it's not as if we're, kind of writing off the money,
right,
the investment, right? So, what we're thinking about is what does it really cost to finance that portfolio of players?
Yeah.
Right. So, because of course, some players will go up in value and some players will go down in value. But, I would argue that, the investments that we've made, have continued to, as a balance, continue to hold their value. And really, therefore, we're not spending the money, we're investing the money. And really, we're just thinking about the cost to carry.
Yeah.
What's it cost to carry that portfolio of players that are obviously so valuable?
I want to widen the aperture even more and still stay in this topic to talk about media, because you have assets there as well through Eldridge, whether it's with Rolling Stone, Golden Globes, A24, obviously in the movie business, Cirque du Soleil. You understand the media world. The media world is part of the intrinsic value. We just spent a lot of time talking about this on the panel in sports. How do you see the media element of this evolving in the near term? We've got an NBA, media rights deal that's going to be announced probably any day now. What happens next with media as it relates to sports and the value of sports?
So, right, if you think about how you break apart the value of a club or a team, right, you have everything that goes on site, right? You've got the tickets, the merch, the hospitality, the food and beverage, the sponsorship inside of the actual facility. And then, the media value is the glow, right, that comes out of the facility, whether it's an arena or a stadium or whatever it is. And then you think about, okay, well, how do I expand and extend that glow, mm-hmm, right? And I think obviously the thing that really is driving these is that there's now trillion-dollar balance sheets or trillion-dollar market value companies that have gotten involved, right? So it used to be you would have kind of the broadcasters thinking about it. Now you've got Amazon, Google, Apple that are all playing in the game. And you look at them, and together they're probably worth, I don't know, $6 trillion or something, $5 trillion.
And not to mention Netflix, who's probably around the hoop.
Yeah, and Netflix is, it's a big company.
Yeah. But
compared to those guys, it's really not so big. Right. But it's, I think, probably a $300 billion market cap.
Right.
And now they're throwing their hat in the ring, because they understand, that people want to watch this stuff. And, there's very few things that people will adjust their calendar for, right? So, and sports are probably it.
Right.
Maybe some award shows, but certainly sports.
Right. And if you look at, Major League Baseball, it is a tale of the haves and have-nots in many ways when it comes to media. The Dodgers, that was a key part of your investment thesis, I believe, when you bought the Dodgers, is the sort of implicit value on the media side, correct?
100%.
Yeah.
When we bought the club, it was 2012, and the media rights were coming up for renewal in 2013, right? So, and how we valued that was a real appreciation for what we thought the media rights were, right? And, MLB is even more complicated, right? Because you've got the cable system. Back then, it's now kind of crumbling a little bit, but you have the cable system that would then go into the RSN, and then the dollars in the RSN would go into the team, right? And the dollars that would stay at the RSN were not subject to revenue sharing.
Right.
So, the revenue sharing is really what goes on at the team, but not at the RSN. So we ended up getting $8.4 billion over 25 years. That went from the cable companies into the RSN, and we only had to invest $3 billion from the RSN into the team.
Right.
Roughly, rough math.
Right.
Right. So that was absolutely part of the strategy. And, the revenue sharing was based on the $3 billion roughly that was coming from the RSN into the team, and everything that stayed in the RSN, and we owned 100% of the RSN.
And so does the same upside exist as you look at Chelsea and the EPL and soccer more globally? Does the same upside exist for media, you think, for soccer?
Football, yeah. I think that it's hard to be here and call it soccer.
I know. But it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing for me.
But I think there's no bigger sport in the world in terms of demand, right? And you go anywhere in the world and people know the top football clubs, and even in the U.S., I think the time slots that the Premier League has in the U.S. on Saturday and Sunday doesn't really compete with anything.
Right.
Right. And obviously the NFL is trying to figure out how do I do more games in London and Munich and places like that, because of course that works really well for them, because then you wake up and you have, breakfast with the NFL.
Right.
But that's every week, with the Premier League. Right. Right. Is the Saturday morning time zone, in the East Coast at least, and a little bit earlier on the West Coast. But yeah, I think that, because there's so much implicit demand, so what you have to figure out how to do is how do you get direct relationships with your fan bases? Right. Right. And how do you do things that, are unique and different? But obviously what we have is an asset in Chelsea that, is in high demand. Right. Right. And we can give experiences that, you just can't buy elsewhere. So how do we start to think about, how to, position, those opportunities in order to really grow revenue, in a world where, financial fair play is becoming, a much more, detailed conversation, and I think something that, the league is committed to in order to try to, have a more balanced, competitive slate. Right.
And do you think financial fair play is at the place it needs? What else needs to happen to ensure that there actually is fair play?
Well, it's coming. I mean, I think you're seeing a lot of debate about what percentage of revenue can be spent on the team, and that's happening, and likely to be voted on in the June Premier League meeting and finalized. And then there's another concept that if you think about one is top down and one is bottom up, there's another concept called anchoring, which is saying that the maximum wages for the team can only be a certain multiple of the smallest amount of media money that goes to the 20th Premier League team.
Right. And so as you look at this portfolio, we only have a couple minutes left, and I could talk to you all afternoon about this, but as you look at your portfolio now, you do have some unbelievable assets. You also have this, massive business and credit, et cetera, that you also have to, that I have not asked you anything about because we're talking about sports, which is sort of your burden and opportunity. This is the life you've chosen. But do you see other opportunities in sports? The NFL is, about to open to institutional investors. I imagine you've looked at the NFL before. Are there startup leagues? Are there other things that sort of at least sort of tickle your brain as an opportunity in sports?
Oh, I think there's just so many adjacencies. Yeah. And like I was an early investor in DraftKings, and you start to see how that continues to develop, and I think there's a lot of debate right now going on as to is gambling good for the game, right, or games, and I would argue that there was always gambling. And whether it was in the black market or in the legal market, I think it's much better in the legal market. And I think what you've seen this year is, you can see the sports radars of the world can see when there's someone crowding a specific bet. Right. Right. So there was a situation with one of the players on one of the NBA teams, where they basically were doing prop bets on how many minutes they were going to play. And there was an incident where he basically pulled himself out of the game, because he had a contact lens issue. But then Sports Radar basically said, well, why is everyone betting that this no-name player, is going to be playing less than 4 minutes? I can't remember what it was. And they immediately identified it.
Yeah.
Right. So, I think that, because now it's basically like a real market, right, where people see where the flows are going. And, so when strange things are happening, you can respond really quickly.
Right.
So, I think we're just getting started at, how that's going to, really protect the integrity of the game versus, in the old scandals, it was all done in the black market.
Right. I'm going over time just to ask you this one last question. Women's sports came up on the panel previously. It feels like there's investment happening at Chelsea specifically on the women's side in terms of the opportunity there. Is that something you're interested in broadly?
I learned about that reading about it in the paper. So, it's amazing how many things I learn about reading about. So,
but in terms of the opportunity for women's sports, is that something you see in general?
Oh, yeah. I mean, obviously, the Caitlin Clark phenomenon has been nothing short of just amazing, right? The men's Final Four had a lower media audience than the women's Final Four this year.
Right.
And that was Caitlin Clark, and she played her first game last night and proved that she deserves to be in the WNBA, scored 20 points in her first game. And I think it's just getting started. You're going to see the WNBA continue to grow. You're going to see women's soccer, football around the world, the NWSL.
Right.
Angel City is talked about being up for sale. So, I would be shocked if that, doesn't go for at least $200 million.
Right.
And who would have thought, a year or 2 years ago, when the Washington Spirit just traded for $33 million or something, that you're going to see, the Angel Cities club trade for 200.
Right.
And, I think one of the things we believe very much, is that the Chelsea's women team is a top women's team in the world, and is going to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And we're starting to see sponsors recognize the fact that, they got to get on board.
Right.
Because, it's good for their brand.
Right. You're a gentleman for spending time with me. Thank you so much. Really good to see you.
Thank you, Jason.
Thanks.